want to welcome everybody to the last session of the day here today. I'm Rob Atkinson. I'm president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. ITIF is a think tank here in Washington that, among other issues like IT, we also focus in a pretty serious and in-depth way on clean energy innovation. And in all modesty, have probably done more on clean energy innovation policy than any group in Washington. We've worked extensively on issues like the role of pricing in innovation, done an enormous amount of work on the role of ARPA-E and other kinds of specific technology policies in clean energy innovation. We've also been doing a lot of work on what we call green mercantilism, looking at how foreign countries are making taking a wide array of unfair trade practices to specifically attack U.S. clean energy innovation competitiveness. I'll just ask my colleague Matt Stepp to raise his hand there. Matt is the lead of all our work at Clean Energy. So I want to focus today on the role of patents and IP in energy. And before I introduce our speakers, I just want to relate that even though the U.S. is certainly not a laggard when it comes to clean energy patents, a study that we recently did on green mercantilism, we found actually that the U.S. ranks 14th in the world on patents, on clean energy patents per million residents. So we're not number one. In fact, we're about a third of the patenting rate of countries like Denmark, Japan, Sweden, and Germany, who patent much, much more than we do when it comes to clean energy. But at the same time, other countries like China, who sell a lot, certainly don't patent a lot. They mostly obtain their IP in other ways, shall we say. So today, given the importance of IP in driving clean energy innovation and supporting it, we want to focus on that. I'm just going to go right down the line here, right from my left, to start with Brian O'Shaughnessy, Esquire, who's a shareholder at the law firm RatnerPrestia. And Brian works with innovators to protect their IP rights and tailoring business practices to reduce the risk of infringing and the rights of others. He's been a long-standing and active member of the Licensing Executive Society, serving on its board of trustees since 2007. He's also appeared in the IAM 250, the world's leading patent and technology licensing lawyers, for several years, and most recently in the IAM 1000. Next to Brian is Dr. David Parekh, who is the Vice President, Research and Technology at United Technologies Research Center. Brian, prior to joining UTRC in 2007, he was Deputy Director of Georgia Tech Research Institute. And prior to that, he's had positions at Boeing Phantom Works and McDonnell Douglas Research Laboratories. He's also been a member of the National Research Council's Aeronautics Research and Tech Roundtable and on the executive board of the DOE Energy Efficient Building Hub. Next is Erin-Michael Gill, who's the Chief Intellectual Property Officer at MDB Capital. Before joining the firm, Brian was a special advisor to the Undersecretary of Commerce for Intellectual Property and the Director of the USPTO. In that role, he played a key role in policy development and coordination of IP policy across the U.S. government. He's also had IP and product management roles with DuPont. And finally, Sarah Harris, who is Senior Vice President and Deputy General Counsel for IP at AOL. She's responsible for establishing AOL's IP policies and managing all of their IP property issues. Prior to that position, she's held similar chief intellectual property roles at Cooper Industries and held different IP roles at HP and also Compaq Computer Corporation. So with that, we'll just start off. Each panel will take about a little more than 5 minutes or so. We'll have a little bit of time for discussion and then time for questions.
Thank you, David. All right. Well, I'm Brian O'Shaughnessy. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. When I start talking about IP and IP strategy in particular, I always like to think of first principles. And so particularly when you're talking to people in the technology space, I think it's important to think about what your IP really is supposed to do. So with that, I guess I would like to tell you a little story about an event that took place about 5 or 6 years ago. And I'm going to paraphrase a good friend of mine who's actually in the room with us here today, Ada Nielsen. Go ahead, raise your hand, Ada. Former president of the Licensing Executive Society. Ada and I were teaching a licensing of technology course in Prague. And this was the first time I actually had gone behind what was the Iron Curtain. And so we're teaching this licensing course and we're telling people about the value of IP. And Ada gets up and the first thing that she says is, IP and licensing, it's all about making money. If you're not making money, you're wasting your time. And so that's what you need to think about when you're thinking about your IP strategy. How is this going to help somebody make money? And your strategy is going to differ very substantially depending upon whether or not you're a small entity or a large entity. I have large entities that I counsel in their IP portfolio who have told me not one single piece of our IP is so important to us that it should ever be an SEC reportable event if we should lose it. And so they take a very, very incremental approach to their IP. On the other hand, I also counsel a lot of small startups. They might only have one or two pieces of IP. That's what I refer to as their franchise IP. If they lose that IP, it's not just a reportable event, they're dead. And so consequently, they have to focus much more with a different focus on their IP. And so you need to take these sorts of things into account when you're looking at your IP portfolio and looking at your strategy and how it is that you're actually going to make money from your IP. David?
Thank you, Brian. It's an interesting perspective for me as I look at this, not being an IP lawyer, but one very much in the middle of IP. When I was at Georgia Tech, thinking about what innovation the university had and who might be interested in it, and now at United Technologies, responsible for generating a lot of the foundational IP for the corporation. Thinking about things from efficient jet engines to efficient heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And what's interesting about that is the questions at the heart of what you have to talk about are very similar. Whether you're a research center trying to interest the corporation in taking something out to market, or you're an entrepreneur at a university or small company trying to think about how to bring that to a potential customer. And what I found is a lot of the folks in the research community are really tuned and geared and know how to write a wonderful proposal about the compelling idea, how their efficiency is better than another, or their material better than another, and things of that fashion. And they win these great proposals. But then when you shift and say, okay, how do I present the value of this to someone who might be interested in commercializing it, it's a whole different set of questions. And so in my engagement with folks over the years, I've come up with a set of 7 simple questions to encourage people to shift from what is often a notion of invention and that in terms of new compelling ideas for research into what matters in terms of commercialization. And one is to make sure people realistically value their IP, and there'll probably be some discussion of that on the panel here, because often when someone invents something they think is the greatest thing and they don't realize there are other alternatives, they don't know the value in terms of the context of others who are doing the similar thing in the market. Secondly, how does this innovation fit in the system? You may have a great battery, a great chip that's higher temperature, and you don't understand what it takes to actually implement it in the system. Because of everything else, the chain effect of what else it changes in the system. And often when people have an invention, they don't know enough about the impact on the system and what it would take to actually modify the system to be able to incorporate that invention. And without that, then you're trying to sell someone on your great idea without understanding the full system context. Thirdly, business model. And what you find, whether you're going from pharma to IT to big companies that are industrial, very different philosophies. For some, it's about freedom to practice, being able to assure that they can take that to practice, whereas others want to use their IP to fence everybody else out. And if you're talking to someone who simply wants to know they have access to freedom to practice versus someone who wants to own everything, it's a different conversation. And if you don't understand that in terms of their model, you can often be talking past each other in that regard. Fourth thing is thinking about cost and price. Realistically, what will it cost to bring this forward, and what price, which is different than cost, will the market be willing to take on and accept? And often you can have, again, a wonderful thing, but it may cost too much to make. So along with valuing the IP, thinking about the system context, thinking about the business model and issues of cost and price, one also needs to think about scalability. If you have something, say, for energy storage, that only works in the laptop, okay, you have some market there. If it also works in cars, okay, more interest. If it also works in the grid, and that technology is scalable from end to end, you have something really special there if you know how to bring that to market. And so knowing whether you're in a niche or if you have a technology that's easily scalable is important. One thing that often technologists miss, because we think it's easy once we invent it, is the manufacturing readiness of the technology. Do we understand what it'll take to make? Where would you make it? And what are the challenges with regard to manufacturing it? And lastly, as a seventh question I encourage people to think about, is who's the end customer and how will they value it? Because often you're talking to maybe a company like us, UTC, or someone else, who is sort of an intermediate customer but not the end customer. And so you really want to think about that whole chain. And you certainly won't have answers to all these questions at the beginning, but I think if you have these in mind, as you engage with folks, you'll know what to ask, what to listen for, and it'll make you a lot smarter about putting your innovation in context of the folks who are listening to you.
Great, thank you.
Okay. My name is Erin-Michael Gill. I'm the Chief Intellectual Property Officer for MDB Capital Group. We're a sponsor here at ARPA-E. And we're here looking for early stage technology companies that either have or have the ability to obtain a dominant intellectual property protection around a world-changing technology.
Hey, can you move the mic a little?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Can everyone hear me now?
Perfect. That's
Great,
fine.
thanks. So a little of my background, I'm a registered patent agent, so I'm not an attorney as well, but I passed the bar, and I'm a FINRA registered broker-dealer as well. So my concern, my focus is on portfolios and making sure people build portfolios for the right reason, understanding why people build portfolios, and using that to communicate to folks to allocate capital to the most disruptive technologies most efficiently. It's very, very complicated. It's hard to do well, but if you do it well, you can see outsized returns. So, you know, it's hard for, you know, in a room like this to get everyone to have all the takeaways, but if you're going to write anything down, I would just like to leave 4 points that are very simple that hopefully are useful to the folks in the room. There are 4 primary reasons for building a patent portfolio, and if your patents don't fall into any of these 4 reasons, then they're probably something that should be reevaluated. All right? Number 1 is product. I've invented something, I have a product, I've got a new chemical, I have a new drug, bang. I have a patent that covers the product, it's very clear. The value of the patent is tied to the value of the product. Okay? So when you're talking about your patent value, you don't talk about the patent, you talk about this product as this market, this opportunity, and bang, it's very clear how the IP supports whatever incremental innovation you've done. Saying, okay, well, this is 10% better, this is marginally better, and we know why because it's protected by this IP. So if somebody else comes into that market, your job is to exclude them, is to limit the amount of infringement, number 1. Product number 1. Number 2, ecosystem. Okay? So you're building a portfolio not necessarily because I have one particular product, this is the gold, right? It's that you have not just your commercialized product protected, but all of these alternatives protected as well. You say, oh, well, 90% of patents aren't practiced, so they're not valuable. No. It's that one patent that is practiced is infinitely more valuable in the context of a portfolio. And when others come and they want to be in your market, they want to be in your space, you're going to enable not just your technology, but other technologies. And you create ecosystems around your company. So massive cross-licensing agreements take place. You know, where you have suppliers, vendors, customers, competitors in some cases, where you think about thousands of patents, not individual 1, 2, 3. The third bucket, the third reason for having a patent portfolio is revenue. So you're saying these 2 or 3 ideas, if well protected, could enable a joint venture with a major development company. Or these, you know, patents I know I have because I can sell them for $2 million a piece. If you're generating revenue, or you're going to spin up a licensing program, or you're going to put them in a publicly traded shell or something like that. But the purpose for its being is to generate revenue directly. Again, when you're valuing the assets, you know very clearly this is the revenue that's going to be produced, this is why. In this model, more infringement is better, right? So the more people are infringing your patents, the more valuable they can end up because it can enable a licensing opportunity. The fourth one, which is a little less well known, is communication value. Saying, I'm an early stage technologist, I don't have a product, I don't even have revenue to talk about, but the patent office has validated that these 25 ideas are novel for these various reasons, and that I'm bringing it to you because I think now we're going to begin commercialization based on the IP that I have here. So it's not just trust me, I've got 30 years experience and a PhD. It's I have all this validation around this technology that even if it doesn't work, even if I'm not the right guy to take it forward, I have a substantial underlying asset which perhaps raises the floor value of my company, of the opportunity. So I'll leave a lot of the rest to questions, but I just want to take away product, ecosystem, revenue, and communication value when you're thinking about building a portfolio and you're thinking about how to value these assets.
Thank you. Hi, as you said, I'm Sarah Harris, and I'm honored to be here at this event and on this panel. So what I'm here to tell you about a deal that we did at AOL and show you how patents can be incredibly valuable in a somewhat unexpected way based on what we're talking about. So this is, it's like 20 minutes that I'm cramming into 6 minutes, so I'm going to talk very, very quickly. You can ask questions at the end.
Karen, can you move the mic a little closer?
Is that better? I'm sorry, okay. Did y'all hear what I said earlier? Excuse me. So the deal that I'm talking about is last year we sold 90% of our patent portfolio to Microsoft for almost $1.1 billion. And even though this was in the internet space, a lot of the issues that we dealt with are relevant in any industry. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on AOL, then kind of give what I call the anatomy of the deal, and just kind of point out some issues as we go along. So AOL was originally an ISP, or Internet Service Provider, and it's now a content and branding company whose mission is to inform, entertain, and connect the world. So drastically different business models. And you're probably thinking, how did a branding company generate so much revenue off of its portfolio? Well, the reason is because AOL itself was a pioneering internet company, and we had the patents that were referred to earlier as franchise patents. And we also acquired probably 10 companies that were also very early stage companies in the internet space, like Netscape, CompuServe, MapQuest, and all of these had what I call foundational patents. And as a consequence, we thought they were reasonably valuable. And the reason that I'm telling you about this is because these companies did take the time and the resources to protect their innovation. So they had the product, and they got the patents on the product. So I started at AOL in 2007. And I walked in the door, the next day they laid off 15% of the workforce. And I was told to cut the patent portfolio management budget in half. And I was like, oh boy, I'm so glad it came. So I asked for kind of a summary of the portfolio relative to business, and we didn't have that. So I was a little bit concerned on trying to cut down all this money, which at the time was $7 million. And I say that because I just want to give you some feel for how much it does cost to build and maintain a portfolio, because at the time we had about 500 patents, probably equally as many applications. So it is a pretty costly endeavor, and many, many times business people view that spend as discretionary, particularly when times are tough. So you kind of have to fight for keeping your portfolio in check. So at the time, we needed money to investigate the portfolio, but I don't know if you remember what was going on at AOL in 2007. We were part of Time Warner. We'd switched from a subscription-based business to an ad-supported business, and the subscription revenue was going down a lot faster than the ad revenue was coming up. So it was very difficult to get discretionary spending. Fast forward to 2009, 2010. New CEO, new management team, and new business model. We became a content company. We spun out from Time Warner and thankfully kept the patents after a little bit of horse trading. But again, we were in turnaround mode, but at this point in time, we'd had a chance to look at some of the patents, and we felt that we had something pretty valuable and that we could possibly utilize these to help the company. I mean, either through a licensing program, enforcement, strategic partnerships, but again, we couldn't get the discretionary spending to do the deep dive into the portfolio. So moving forward to 2010, 2011, very interesting things were happening in the patent space. The non-practicing entity or patent troll litigation, are y'all familiar with that? Okay, so it was just surging, particularly in the internet space. And the mobile patent wars were just surging as well. And all of a sudden, we started getting unsolicited offers to purchase our patents, which is pretty unheard of, because usually when somebody does that, it's possible that they're actually infringing them, so usually people don't want to put up their hands, but that was a huge indicator of value. And we kept trying to get some traction with our management team, but we were in turnaround mode, and even though I'd send up little industry stats, it wasn't until mid-2011 when Nortel sold its portfolio for $4.5 billion out of bankruptcy. Then I got a return phone call. And they said, how much is ours worth? I said, well, first off, it's very difficult to value IP. But second, I think, based on what I know of it, it's probably worth more than Nortel's on a price per patent basis. But I really can't tell you until we do the deep dive. So finally, after 4 years, we got the funding to do the deep dive and do the full-blown analysis. Then we took the results of the analysis to our board in October, November, and then again in December, at which point they authorized the start of a process to investigate whether or not we should spin off some of our non-core assets. And in some instances, we felt that our patents could fall into that category. Again, as they said earlier, there's many ways to value or monetize a patent. I mean, you can sell it, you can license it, you can try to enforce it, you can use it to enter into a strategic partnership. And they all have varying risks with varying rewards. So the sale of a patent is typically the least risky, but it also is perceived as providing the least amount of return. So even though there's all this stuff going on in the mobile space, those are all strategic. Like one of the participants wanting to shore up their position against another, or keeping the other person from doing so. So we thought, in order to maximize our shareholder value, we could consider a sale, but the only way that we'd really be able to maximize shareholder value would be if we had a strategic opportunity. Fast forward again, early 2012, Facebook announces its IPO. Yahoo immediately sues Facebook. And Facebook's at a disadvantage. It's a very young company. It had only a few patents. Yahoo had a whole huge portfolio. And voila, it was the perfect opportunity for a strategic play in the internet space, because we had some patents that Facebook could definitely use. So in a very short period of time, only a few weeks, we selected the patents that we were going to divest, went to the board, initiated a closed auction, and then signed a deal with Microsoft for $1.056 billion to sell 90% of our portfolio. And a component of that was a license back to the patents that we retained. And then a month later, Microsoft announced that it was going to sell a component of the patents that we sold to them to Facebook for $650 million. So it ultimately got there, and it was very, very beneficial for us. And it was the reason I want to talk to you about it is because we've done all the work to really know our portfolio, and I call it portfolio optimization. We were able to do something very quickly, and it might seem counterintuitive to sell 90% of your portfolio, but because our business model had changed so drastically, we felt that we could divest these assets and still be fine with respect to our business. And the result was fantastic for our company. On the day that we announced the deal, the stock went up 43% above the pre-deal price, and today it's 150% above the pre-deal price, and we were the top performing stock in our sector. So it was a very good deal for us. So, and interesting enough,
we need to move. Can
okay.
We wrap up?
I'm done.
You all set? Beautiful. Yeah. Wonderful. So the things are up there on the screen if you want to ask a question, and it'll come up here on my little screen. But before we do that, I want to ask the folks here, and just either any of the four of you or more, just jump in. Is there anything that's different or unique about the patenting and IP space in energy, particularly clean energy, that tends to be more risky and newer? Should we just sort of apply generalized IP policies to this space, or is there something unique about it?
I could say that, when when I started the introduction, I said, we look for companies that have, either have or have the ability to obtain a dominant IP portfolio. In this space, what's hard is there's so much uncertainty still. Which platforms are going to work, which technologies are going to be, adopted. The uncertainty is still fairly large. And so placing bets is still fairly difficult. So when you say, well, clean energy versus, say, the internet space, you can say, well, bang, here it is, small investment. You're going to see how these ecosystems, how these things work together, how we're going to improve X, Y, or Z, bang. This one says, well, if this technology works and we get an additional $1 billion of funding, we're going to be able to ramp this out nationwide. And it's just a different sort of dynamic. And that when people are uncertain, the IP landscape ends up looking, as you were talking about these analysis, very fragmented. There's some pockets over here, people doing things, and over here, and it's very hard to glean, who the dominant player is going to be early on. So what we've seen, and what MDB is invested in one of the companies that and is taking public one of the companies that was an ARPA-E awardee and winner the last several years. We're doing that because the technology that they had was in a very discrete and measurable space. What they were going to be going after was very clear and concrete, and it was immediate. It was near term. It wasn't infinite. It was right on the horizon. And because of that, they were able to enable a licensing play where other people manufacture. Their IP were able to help them develop it, and they were able to obtain this important position that could attract additional investment. So what makes it unique? It's still very fragmented, and it's hard to pick winners. It's not like there's a clear wave behind RFID. Everyone's doing RFID. You're on that wave. It's clear. It's still very difficult, but it is possible with a little bit of nuance.
Great. David?
Yeah, I would add two things. One, timescale and capital. Because one of the interesting things, if you think about just a couple years ago, you wanted everyone in the world to be able to see your video and how you might share that video, and you roll out a YouTube or something like that, and it's quite compelling. Or someone who says, well, I want to be able to share 160 characters so that my friends would know that right now I'm at ARPA-E Summit on a panel. These kinds of things you can roll out relatively quickly. But if you think about energy is on a different time scale. When you think how long that takes to move, and say you have a technology that could replace a gas-fired plant, and you go to a company that's invested millions and billions in a gas-fired plant where their business case was this plant would be operating for the next 30 or 40 years. And it's been running for 2 years, and all of a sudden you want to tell them all that money they set aside for the 30 or 40 years, they should now invest it in your other green technology and get rid of their plant. And I think this is where often there's a challenge and confusion, because there is a lot of wonderful information technology that's relevant to clean tech. But it's an intersection of two very different timescales. And as I've worked with colleagues who've sort of come from the IT world, you see that they have a different mindset about their patience for the return on their investment and what it'll take. And imagine you're a small company trying to push a new energy technology forward, and it may take you 15 years to really be able to capture some market and get the return on that. Well, pretty soon your patent's about to expire. And so I think while the principles on how you manage IP and value it probably are similar, there are big differences in terms of time scale and also some of the capital requirements.
Great. Thank you. Brian?
Yeah, I would add to that. I think that that's a very good point, and I think that the nature of the technology and its lifespan in the industry is extremely important, and we've seen this in other nascent industries and other nascent technologies. So, for example, with the biotechnology boom, very similar sort of long-term product development cycle. You had to go through all kinds of regulation to finally find that you had a product. And so it required a very, very strategic approach to IP, and I think that's true in the energy world as well. You can't go off and try to patent every gee whiz wow innovation that you get. You got to think about, how does this really advance my business model, my business objectives, and then you have to be very strategic about which of the innovations you actually want to protect. Is this the core innovation that really is central to our future business model, and is this really going to advance our strategic objectives? You leave the more incremental stuff to the people who might want to tinker around the edges. You can't protect it all, so you just have to be strategic.
So would everybody agree with that statement that given that it costs time and money to protect IP, particularly through patents, that you can't do everything, or sometimes you can't do everything? Would everybody agree with that statement that that's the right way to frame that you sort of pick the strategic things that are the crown jewels, and maybe how else would you go about doing that?
Yeah. No,
Erin-Michael.
I would say that the concept of a crown jewel is, it's a little bit of a reaction for me, because I very much so think about, if everyone had a takeaway saying, okay, well, we have some metrics against which we're gonna measure why we're doing these patents, getting your hands around all of the IP, the potential, the intellectual capital inside of your company in one spot. Just put it on a spreadsheet, 2 or 3 sentences, and bang, lay them out. Maybe you have 200 or 300 potential inventions. And then doing a prioritization where you have the CEO, the CTO, the CFO, whoever the right people are, put them in the room and say everyone's going to weigh in on each one of these ideas. I mean, when MDB engages with a firm, we're raising money for them, we're also doing this process with them. Because it's critical that you're not going forward with these, oh, well, this is it. Because what if this is it, 6 months from now is no longer what this is it. And having a portfolio approach where you're saying, okay, these 15 ideas, we all agree are the critical ones to go forward, and we know why we're doing it, is the way to sort of protect the entirety of what the opportunity could be, not just one thing. I know you have a big portfolio to manage as well. So.
Well, and I just, even though we are a different industry, I think the issues are exactly the same. Statistically speaking, usually out of 100 patents, only 3 to 5 are the holy grail, and you never know which 3 to 5 those are when you file. So you do have to file a statistical sample in order to make sure that you do get it. Agreed, you can't file on everything, but you should try to focus on what exactly you're going to productize for sure. But you have to file enough to make sure that you have a significant volume, because you do not know which one's going to hit.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would add one of my favorite allegories about an IP portfolio is that of the iceberg. And your IP portfolio really generally looks like an iceberg. And that is everything that's underneath the water, which we all know is about 80% of the mass of the iceberg, is your trade secrets and your know-how. The stuff that's above the water is stuff that can be seen. Those are your patents. And so consequently, you have to treat all of that information as valuable IP, but you don't protect it all in the same way. And another story, if I can relate to you, a friend of mine was formerly the VP for R&D at GM, and I asked him how he approached his IP portfolio. And he said, he actually used the allegory of the iceberg, and he said, I could give all of my patents tomorrow to VW, and it wouldn't do them a damn bit of good, because they wouldn't know how I take a hunk of metal, rubber, and wires at one end of the plant and kick a car out at the other end of the plant. My patents are the icing on the cake. That's where I protect the really valuable stuff, the core technology. But it's the other stuff that also has great value, and that's probably the greater volume of our intellectual property.
So I want to follow up on that, but before I do, I'm not seeing any questions on the screen, which either means none of you are asking any questions or that our technology has failed miserably. So one of those is right. So if the technology is failing, let me know. Just on that point, when we passed patent reform bill in Congress, I guess 2 years ago or so, we moved from a first to invent to a first to file country, essentially to harmonize with what virtually every other country in the world is doing. How does that change affect how entrepreneurs in the audience might be thinking about patenting?
What? Sure. I mean, it certainly has made a profound change for us inside the company, in terms of, well, one, it's good because you're harmonizing what you have across the world, and for an enterprise like ours with, 220,000 people around the globe and engineering research around the globe, then everyone's working to the same principles. But often where people may wish to engage with their colleagues outside in terms of the technology or partnership, you have to really get all your ducks in a row first and make sure that's all in place, whereas you might have had a window of a year before. And so I think you're going to see significant shifts and it's really about speed, I think would be the one word, where it's changing sort of the tempo by which people take sort of the idea and invention and lock it up and wrap it up before they engage with others.
Did you want to, Erin-Michael, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. The first to, so for everyone that we've been, the entrepreneurs that I deal with, unfortunately, just not just for MDB, but a lot of times the issue is that they're out talking about their invention before they have any money, right? And that what happens is they don't have any money, so who cares? It's never going to happen, so it doesn't matter. And what I think probably everybody on this panel would be advising all along: never do that, because if you do that, you're going to lose your rights in Europe anyway. You're going to lose your rights everywhere else anyway. So you could say effectively, from a commercialization, from an IP perspective, this has always been the case, that good policy is telling entrepreneurs, do not talk about inventions outside of NDAs. Do not talk about, or do not publish things, at least with having a provisional filed. Things like that, provisional applications could be useful, carefully. Please don't just Xerox research notebooks and send them in. Big companies do that too, by the way, and it's still a bad idea. But the shift to first to file, the real issue is actually going to be for your attorneys. Can I see a show of hands of how many attorneys are in the room, if I could? Oh, okay. How many engineers or scientists? Oh, okay, great. So go to your attorneys, all right? And if they're trying to say, file a provisional, and it's like a low-cost, cheap way to get a patent, that's not the case, all right? So you still need to do the same work to enable your invention to do a provisional today. And I think it becomes more important to their point about speed and everything else, because all it means is you don't have to pay the filing fee of a non-provisional, but you should still have claims. You should still have enabled specifications. So even though it sounds sexy to, I'm just going to throw a bunch of provisionals in there, do the work and maybe go back and consider doing non-provisional applications. It makes a big difference in terms of a lot of things that are legal noise right now. But just, that's something that I think is an important takeaway. And that is the other important thing is that if you're in a hot area, so this is most important if you're in an area where there's a lot of innovation, a lot of competing folks in the same space. In the old way, you could swear behind a reference, meaning as long as you invented it first and you could show, okay, I'm swearing behind this reference, you can do that. Now in the new way, it's a little bit less clear about what the grace period is and things like that. There's a lot of uncertainty. So everybody's point is the same. Get it into the patent office as quickly as you can. If you're going to raise money, try to do it under an NDA. Everyone hates doing it, but it's really important. And file them as non-provisionals with real core invention. Don't try to just slap 100 provisionals together thinking it's a cheap patent, because you could do far more damage than good.
So actually I don't want to, we've got a limited amount of time. I know I actually want to try to get through some of the questions. So I'm going to.
I just want to say one thing. The key is, the biggest issue is cost shifting. Because you're now having to get the money to pay for the patent, which could be pretty expensive. So that's the biggest difference for us.
Okay. So there's a question.
Can I add one more? Because I think for this audience, so I said speed 1. Seconds. Maybe 1B is it actually changes your strategy and how you do your R&D. Because before you might have had the luxury that you invented, and you could over time figure out where to explore and what it is you want to protect till you got to the point you could write a good patent application. But now all of a sudden you have to think, okay, what are the critical paths I need to figure out early, because while I'm busy in the lab, someone else may file a patent. And I no longer have that protection. So it's not only speed, but it's potentially changing the sets of questions you ask and how you pursue that in terms of your critical path research.
And also volume.
I want to jump in. So there's a couple of questions here about place, and we were just talking about time. There's a couple of questions here about, is it worth patenting in China, in Europe? Is it enforceable? So how should entrepreneurs think about the global patent system? How do you make those trade-offs?
Well, I would say, again, do you want to take it?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
You first.
I would say from my perspective, again, it all depends upon the industry that you're in. In the high technology industry, where your product life cycle is very short, very rapid, I don't think we're still there yet. In the pharmaceutical world, I think it's still up for debate. A lot of the pharmaceutical companies are going in with both feet, and they think China ultimately will come around. I think they've made a lot of progress in a very short period of time, but you have to remember that in China, enforcement of IP is still a government function. It's not a private function. And so you have to rely on the government to enforce your IP rights. And the government does not understand the concept of trade secrets. They don't even have a symbol for it. And furthermore, they don't have a notion about how they should understand how your trade secrets fit into your business model. And so they don't have an effective trade secret protection regime at all. And so again, you might be able to get some fundamental patent protection, but that's going to be the be-all and the end-all, and then enforcement is still a very, very big question mark.
Sarah?
And we focus on where the potential revenue is going to be generated. And if it is in one of those countries, I think you need to hedge your bets. We do. You may not file as many because the enforcement is questionable depending on the technology. But I would still, if you see Europe or Asia as a significant market, I would absolutely file at least some of the core patents, at least the patents that you would feel are core.
The rule of thumb that I was always taught was file in 80% of your market. So you have to take a broad look and say, all right, well, 80% of my market is going to cover tick, 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 these countries, bang. So you say looking for a rule of thumb to talk with your attorney, that's maybe one axiom. The second axiom to your point about, well, what about China? What about India, right? Those are it's still a little bit of the Wild West. It's still a lot of uncertainty, and that's true. However, the acceleration of the improvement of the IP enforcement in those countries has been accelerating. And if we assume that they're going to continue on that path, it's reasonable to say, okay, even if these aren't my markets right now, pharmaceuticals, I'm worried about infringement in India, and oh my God, there's other compelling reasons, there's political reasons to file there. Perhaps that's a consideration that you would talk to with your attorney, who hopefully would have those sorts of insights and expertise. Similarly, in China, you're saying, they're going to manufacturing capability is unbelievable. The infringement opportunity for them to be selling into who knows where is going to be enormous. I need to have some modicum of protection. And again, that's where you get back to your prioritization. All right, here are all my patents that I'm going to file. These tick, tick, tick are all covering my product. All of the ones that are covering my product, not these ecosystem ones, not these revenue, but the product ones, bang, they're going to go to China, EPO, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a reason for, but to your point, it's not like, oh, uniformly we're filing a PCT, we're ticking every box on all the patents everywhere in the world. The costs go to infinity almost immediately. So you got to be strategic, you got to be careful, and make sure you know why you're filing, what you're filing, where you're filing.
So, just quickly pushing back on the China case, because there certainly have been cases where China knows there's a patent in another country. They then patent internally, even though they know that they would have lost that in international patent courts. Then they use the Chinese patent to go after the foreign firm. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's likely to happen in the clean energy space? And would it make any difference if the firm patented in China first?
Yeah. Well, I think the answer is yes. I think that, I've heard of that happening. I've heard of it happening several times, but I've also heard on the other side where people did have an aggressive IP strategy in China. They built a portfolio, and they were, now again, it's never like we would have a whole panel on China IP strategy, right? There's no simple solution. It's a question of like, okay, are you going to have manufacturing in China? Are you going to have a liaison in China who's going to be your partner and your advocate, who is a business person, not a legal person? There's so much nuance to that discussion that it almost, it becomes before the, somebody patented the same thing and now they're using it in sort of patent trollish manners, which is clearly a problem. The question is, you can't divorce it from a business strategy. So long as you have a business strategy for what your concerns are in those areas, then you have a business discussion for how we're going to engage in it, and then that IP, just like everything else, goes underneath and supports that discussion and that strategy.
Great. So there's another question here around the time that it takes a patent application. The PTO used to take a long time, and now they're getting better under the Dave Kapos's leadership, and they're able to keep more money and not divert it back to Congress. And so they're bringing down the pendency rates, but it still takes a little bit of time, like 2 to 4 years, and they're hoping to bring that down. Pardon?
We're getting better.
We're getting better. It used to be longer. So the question is, what should the strategy of entrepreneurs who are waiting for their IP that's already been filed, is there a strategy that you should be engaging in during that interim period, or just sit back and wait?
I can.
Go ahead.
The easy one is for if you're raising capital right away and you think that there's something urgent and hot, there's a couple things to talk to you. There's some relatively little known programs that are relatively new. The one that I advise everyone is having a couple of patents on something called Track 1. It's a new program. It's basically saying if you pay a little bit more money, meaning $2,000 in filing fees, which is relatively high, but pay a little bit more money, the patent office will guarantee that your patent will be soup to nuts done in 12 months. So it's an important program. It's not used as widely as I think it should be. And I encourage everyone that's saying, I need to get not just an application in the door, but I need real protection. Track 1 is the first thing to talk to your attorney about. The second thing, which is very valuable, is the pre-first office action interview program. Again, when I was, when I had the opportunity to be appointed in the administration and write the strategic plan at the USPTO with Dave Kapos and at the time Sharon Barner. The fact is, the rules today say the examiner has to work on the oldest case on their docket, but they are free to pick any other case farther down depending on whatever they want. So if you call the examiner and say, hey, I got a great case for you, it's easy to examine, it's fundamental, I think you're going to this is an easy case for us to go through and negotiate, they will pick it from the back of the line potentially and move it to the front just by giving them a call. So it's a formal program. I don't even think there's any cost to it. So if you've already got IP in the office, that's another one to take use of. The third one is, going back to the foreign applications, if you have patents that are about to be granted, strongly consider with your attorneys the use of the patent prosecution highway. Meaning, you get something granted in the United States, it hasn't yet been examined in Japan, they will fast track it in Japan, they will look at the USPTO's allowance and say, oh, so long as you amend to the same claims that you had in the U.S., it has a much, much higher likelihood of success of getting allowed. The allowance rates are, in some cases, 5, 6, 7 times for first office actions. The rate is normal, and it reduces your prosecution costs substantially. Because if you're not having to have all these negotiations with your attorneys, it ends up being a much more efficient way to get patents through.
I would add another key point. We focus a lot on the IP and maybe back on just on the China piece, and then I'll get to your question. The numbers we heard this morning, this interesting keynote, PIN code of the world, 1114. And you think about 4 billion in Asia. We're in the energy space. 40% of all energy is used in buildings, only 20-some% in transportation. China is building half of the world's new buildings. So you have to figure out how to develop a strategy if you want to really scale in terms of addressing Asia. But what I would say is it's so complex and the cost scales like crazy. In Europe, you're adding countries. So even though you found the EU, you have to add. And so what I would say in a lot of this is you have to have that as part of your strategy. You have to think about that because the opportunity is huge, both in terms of markets and where things are made, which are the two things you want to protect. But there are other ways beyond just the legal paper and the patent. There are things in terms of the technology you can embed, your know-how, sort of the comment earlier about how you put all this stuff together, some of the secret sauce. And I think the other part is in some cases just keep inventing and be out in front of folks. And I think this is where the partnership helps. As we work across the globe, we'll work with colleagues in China, and we actually want to own and work with them on how they file, because we found those who are not as sophisticated, our partners in China may write their application one way, and it impacts our coverage around the globe. And so if nuances like that matter, a small company is not going to know how to do that. Or you have to pay huge fees to get a lawyer, a legal firm who knows how to do that to help you. But it may be a case where you may want to partner with others who know how to do that and figure out how to approach that, because it is tremendously complex, but it can't be ignored because of the 1114 PIN code.
And I guess I would add that, not to sound cynical or sanguine, but, oftentimes you don't want your patent to issue really fast because you don't know what the product is yet. And this is particularly true in the pharmaceutical world. I don't necessarily want it to go down the pike too far, because then I might have to invest a whole lot more money in a product that can't even get past phase 1 clinical trials. So it's the same thing in any industry, particularly a nascent industry. You don't know necessarily how to structure your claims until you're a little bit further down the pike in development. And you do want to file quickly, but you don't always want to issue quickly. And oftentimes we'll use techniques to defer prosecution as much as possible. And that is because your claims are going to evolve over time. And you might want to substantially modify those claims to get at the core innovative features of the product that you're going to want to protect.
So, Brian, I want to follow up probably with a question to you. There are a couple of questions about publishing. One was, if you publish in an academic journal, does that protect your IP? Which is probably no. There's another one, which is, if you patent a core technology, can you then prevent others from patenting subsequent details by publishing them rather than patenting them?
Yes, there is. I mean, there is a strategy for defensive publication where you can essentially knock other people out, and that's going to be a lot more effective under the Patent Reform Act. I tend to think that the Patent Reform Act and the change to the first inventor to file system is not really going to have a big effect, particularly on mature, large, research-oriented companies, because they're already following the international filing strategy anyway. So they're not going to publish until they actually have something on file somewhere. Where it's really going to have an effect is probably in the academic circles and with the entrepreneurs. And the entrepreneurs are much more likely to get out there, start boasting about their product, start promoting it, meeting with people, and you can get out there and get ahead of yourself, and there is nothing more enthusiastic or zealous than an inventor. They really are like their own babies, and you get them talking and you just can't get them to stop. And so that's where the damage really happens, is they're under less rigorous regime, and they're oftentimes not supervised, and they get out talking about the product. So I guess, to your question about whether or not you can lock everything up with one strong filing and then defensive publication, that is one approach. It's not an approach I generally recommend. I mean, certainly you want to get the core of your technology protected, but you also want to be careful about subsequent innovation and the modest improvements. You may not necessarily want to disclose it in the context of a patent application, but you probably also don't want to rely on defensive publication. It's much better to keep it as a trade secret.
Sorry, thank you. We have time for one last question. Then what I'd also like to do is have everybody just spend 30 seconds at the end with some closing comments. But I want to direct these to David and Sarah. There's a question about, how does a small company work with a large, and then they say, and aggressive company without losing IP and independence? So you're a small company, you feel you need to strategically partner with a large company. How do you not get taken to the cleaners? David?
Well, I think you, as I was saying earlier, try to understand what that company is looking for and partner with them. So in many cases, you have IP, you want to understand, do they want an exclusive relationship, or are they going to want multiple suppliers? For yourself as a small company, you have to say, how big is your appetite? Are you going to be content with the scale of the market and be successful, or do you really have to own the whole? And I think it's a matter of being thoughtful in your negotiation in that regard, because, I mean, the big companies, the ones that I'm a part of and the ones that are our peers, want to do the right thing. They would not want to show up in the Wall Street Journal as having violated some principles or ethics with regard to how they worked with a small company. So you should understand these companies want to do the right thing, but it's important as you work with them to also understand, where are they coming from, where you're coming from, and to find that middle ground. I remember one of the VCs in Silicon Valley talking about Stanford, and one of the great things about the university was they're willing to leave money on the table, and they weren't always trying to eke out every last bit of the deal, because at some point, if you try too much to get the ultimate value you could for your IP, you will end up having zero, shutting down the deal, you'll motivate a big company simply to invent around you or find someone else. Whereas if you make it enough that you can capture value, but make it easy enough to work with, that it's sort of a path of least resistance, why would they bother spending all this R&D money and doing something else or finding another supplier if you have a very reasonable proposition in front of them? So I think that's really key, is reasonableness.
Great. Wonderful. Chair?
And I would consider us a relatively big company, but we're only a $2 billion market cap. We used to be $30 billion, so we now think we're small. But assuming we are a large company, yes, we do actually want to engage with third parties, because particularly in our space, innovation happens so quickly, and we definitely respect the intellectual property of others, but we have to balance that with the fact that we don't want to expose ourselves to possible trade secret litigation, because there's a lot of people that will send unsolicited ideas to companies, and you have to be very careful on how you engage with these parties. So I would not suggest that a larger company would take advantage of a smaller company, but the smaller company might need to have a little bit, be a little bit more flexible with what they agree to on the front end with respect to releases and things like that. But
great. So just to bring this all to a close, we can just sort of maybe take 30 seconds if you have any closing thoughts, and we'll start with Brian.
Closing thoughts. Well, again, I guess I would reiterate for everybody the allegory of the iceberg. You know, it's really important to look at your IP from a holistic perspective. It's not all about patents. Oftentimes the trade secrets and the know-how are just as valuable. I think it's important to take into account your business strategy. You have to align your IP strategy with your business strategy, and that often means taking into account where are you in the food chain. Are you a little guy, or are you a big company, global reach, all across borders? And so from that perspective, just take a look at the whole picture, figure out where you are, and devise your strategy accordingly.
Great. Thank you. David?
I guess if I was to emphasize one point, it'd be the importance of system context. Because typically the people invent are really good in one narrow space. That's how they came up with invention and know that really deeply. But without the system context, you don't know its value, you don't know how to engage with folks. You could have the greatest high-temperature power electronics chip, but if it can't be soldered, if it can't deal with EMI, if you can't manage the thermal management and things of that fashion, there won't be much utility for it if it won't last in terms of the life, in terms of robustness and life cycle. So there's a lot of system issues that need to be part of the thinking even while you have that nugget in a narrow space.
Yeah, so just to close up, we talked about before, think about your IP in terms of a portfolio, know why you're developing your IP in terms of whether it protects a product, enables an ecosystem, generates revenue, or has a communications value. You know, our firm MDB has got a booth downstairs. We'd look forward to chatting with anyone that wants to learn more.
let's have 4 different things. Just remember to protect your innovation, or particularly things that you actually productize with patents. Recognize that it's expensive, but it's worth it. Spend the time to optimize your portfolio around your core business strategy. You know, as your business develops, the strategy may change. And make sure that you keep the number of patents that are strategic to your core business model. And remember that you can divest those that you can't. And so we are in a good example of that. Our business model changed, and we're able to recognize a lot of value from our patent portfolio.
Okay. So there were a few more questions I didn't have time to go and ask. Some of them were to individuals up here, so if people have a few minutes, if you had a question for a specific individual, feel free to come on up and ask it. There were also a few questions that seemed like they were really more appropriately asked of ARPA-E officials, so if you're any ARPA-E officials who want to make themselves available too, there's some questions that were there. So I thought this was a really fantastic panel. I learned a lot. I hope you all did, and please join me in thanking 4 great panelists.